We sat next to each other on the same train for 5 years. The day he switched seats changed everything. The morning I found out my entire savings account had been drained to zero, I was standing in line at a bakery holding a coffee and a blueberry scone, watching the cashier's face shift from polite to uncomfortable as my card declined for the third time. It was $6.40. I had over $53,000 in that account the last time I checked, which was 4 days earlier, and now the Wells Fargo app on my phone was showing a balance of $0 with a string of withdrawals I had never authorized, transfers to accounts I had never opened, in cities I had never visited. My legs went soft underneath me. The woman behind me in line asked if I was okay, and I nodded like a liar. I walked out of the bakery without my scone, sat on a bench outside, and scrolled through the transaction history with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. Portland, Reno, Tucson. Somebody had been pulling money from my account in amounts just small enough not to trigger the fraud alert. $900 here, $1,200 there, going back almost 11 months. 11 months of someone quietly eating my life from underneath me. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach fold in half, exactly who had done it. Because 3 weeks earlier, the man who had sat beside me on the 7:15 a.m. northbound commuter train every single weekday morning for 5 years had suddenly, without explanation, switched seats. His name was Elliot Grain, or at least that was the name he gave me, and I'd trusted him the way you trust sunrise. I started taking the 7:15 from Millhaven Station when I was 26 years old, fresh out of a failed engagement with a degree in urban planning and a new job at a municipal development office in the city. I was rebuilding everything that year: my confidence, my credit, my sense of who I was outside of being somebody's fiancé. The train became my sanctuary. Same car, same seat, same 42-minute ride every morning where I could drink my coffee and listen to podcasts and not talk to anyone. Elliot appeared about 3 weeks into my commute. He sat down in the window seat next to me with a leather messenger bag and a copy of some dense nonfiction book about architecture and didn't say a word for the first month. He was maybe mid-30s, clean-shaven, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face you'd describe as pleasant but not memorable. He dressed in business casual, khakis and button-downs, nothing flashy. One morning, my coffee lid popped off and splashed all over my laptop bag, and he silently handed me a pack of tissues from his coat pocket. I thanked him, and he smiled and said, "Occupational hazard of the 7:15. That was our first conversation, and it was so unremarkable that I didn't think about it again for weeks. But that's how it starts, isn't it? Not with fireworks or alarm bells, but with tissues and small talk and the slow accumulation of trust through repetition. Over the next several months, Elliot and I developed what I thought of as a commuter friendship, the kind where you know someone's name and general life situation, but wouldn't recognize them in a grocery store on Saturday. He told me he worked in consulting, something vague about systems analysis for mid-sized companies. He asked about my job, and I told him about urban planning, zoning disputes, the mind-numbing politics of municipal development. He seemed genuinely interested, which was rare because most people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about land use permits. He remembered details I mentioned, asking follow-up questions weeks later about a project I'd referenced or a coworker I'd complained about. At the time, I thought he was just a good listener. Looking back, I can see he was cataloging. Every personal detail I dropped during those 42-minute rides was being filed away. My mother's name, the neighborhood I lived in, the bank I used, the name of my first dog, which I'd mentioned laughing about security questions once. I handed him the keys to my entire life, one casual morning conversation at a time, and never once felt the lock turning. By year 2, Elliot felt like a fixture in my daily routine, as reliable as the train schedule itself. We had unspoken rules. He always took the window seat. I always had the aisle. He never wore headphones, which I found oddly charming because everyone else on that train was sealed inside their own audio bubble. He'd bring me a coffee sometimes if he got to the platform early, always a medium drip with 1 sugar, because I'd mentioned my order exactly once during our first autumn together. I thought it was sweet. I thought it meant he paid attention the way a friend does. We talked about everything and nothing on those rides. Books, weekend plans, restaurants, family. He told me his mother lived alone in Vermont and he visited her every other month. He said he'd been married briefly in his 20s, but it didn't work out. He asked about my failed engagement, and I told him more than I should have, about how my ex had controlled the finances, how I'd spent 2 years rebuilding my credit score from the wreckage, how I'd finally gotten my savings to a place where I felt safe. He nodded and said something about how strong I was, and I believed he meant it. My best friend Joelle kept saying I should invite him for drinks, that our train friendship was basically a romantic comedy waiting to happen. I always laughed it off. Elliot wasn't a love interest. He was a comfort, a warm, predictable presence in a life I was still assembling from scratch. Year 3 brought the first red flag I completely ignored. I got a letter from a credit card company congratulating me on my new account, a Visa with a $15,000 limit that I had never applied for. I called the company and they confirmed someone had opened the card in my name using my social security number, my address, and my mother's maiden name as a security answer. I reported it as fraud and spent an afternoon on hold with 3 different departments, feeling violated but not particularly alarmed because identity theft happens to millions of people every year. I changed my passwords, set up credit monitoring, and mentioned it to Elliot on the train the next morning almost as an afterthought. He frowned and said that was awful, asked if I'd filed a police report. I said I hadn't because nothing had been charged to the card yet. He told me I probably should, just to have it on record. "You can never be too careful," he said, and something about the way he looked at me when he said it felt off for half a second before I dismissed it entirely. A month later, a second credit card appeared. Then a third. Each time I reported it, each time the fraud department froze the account, each time I told myself this was just the cost of living in a digital age. I never connected it to the man sitting 12 inches to my left, 5 days a week. The fourth year was when the financial irregularities started bleeding into my actual accounts. Small charges I didn't recognize on my debit card. A gas station in a town I'd never been to. A subscription service I'd never heard of. An ATM withdrawal of $300 at a branch 40 miles from my apartment. I'd call the bank, dispute the charges, get a new card, and move on. Every time I mentioned it to Elliot, he seemed appropriately concerned. He suggested I get a password manager. He recommended a specific credit monitoring service, which I later learned was a shell company that routed data directly to him. He was helpful in exactly the way that made me trust him more while he was actively dismantling my financial life from the inside. My credit score dropped 19 points in 3 months, and I couldn't figure out why because every fraudulent account I found was supposedly resolved. I started losing sleep over it. Joelle told me I was letting it consume me and I should just freeze my credit and be done with it. I did freeze it, or thought I did, but someone had already set up a phone redirect on my account at one of the 3 bureaus, so the freeze confirmation went to a number that wasn't mine. I didn't discover that for another 5 months. By the start of our 5th year on the train together, Elliot knew everything about me. Not just the security question basics, but the granular architecture of my daily existence. He knew I paid rent on the 1st of every month with an auto transfer. He knew my landlord's name was Gretchen, and that she was technophobic and preferred paper checks as a backup. He knew I had a retirement account through my employer and a separate savings account at a credit union I'd opened specifically because I thought spreading my money across institutions was safer. He knew my work schedule, my gym schedule, when I visited my mother in Connecticut, and which weekends I usually stayed in the city. All of this came from 5 years of morning conversation that I remembered as pleasant and harmless, and that were actually the longest, most patient con I've ever heard of. Elliot never rushed. He never asked suspicious questions. He let information come to him naturally, the way water finds the lowest point. I volunteered every detail he needed because I thought I was talking to a friend, and because 5 years of daily proximity had made him feel as safe as furniture. The thing about trust built through repetition is that it doesn't feel like trust at all. It just feels like reality. The morning Elliot switched seats, it was a Thursday in October, and the air had that sharp, clean bite that makes you pull your jacket tighter. I boarded the 7:15 like always, walked to our car like always, and stopped dead because a woman was sitting in Elliot's window seat, and he was 3 rows back on the opposite side, reading his phone like nothing had changed. I stood there for a moment, confused, then sat in my usual spot next to the stranger. I glanced back at him, and he didn't look up. At our stop, he got off ahead of me and walked quickly toward the stairs without his usual nod or wave. I texted him that afternoon. We'd exchanged numbers during year 2, asking if everything was okay. He replied hours later with something vague about needing a change of scenery on his commute. The next day, same thing. New seat, no eye contact. By the end of the week, it was clear he was avoiding me. I felt confused and slightly hurt the way you do when someone you considered a close acquaintance suddenly goes cold, but I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People drift apart. Trained friendships don't come with obligations. I tried to let it go. 2 weeks later, my bank account was empty. The first 72 hours after discovering the theft were a blur of phone calls and paperwork and barely controlled panic. I called Wells Fargo and spent 4 hours being transferred between departments while someone named Karen in the fraud division asked me to verify details I could barely remember through the fog of adrenaline. They froze my checking and savings accounts, which meant I couldn't pay rent, buy groceries, or fill my gas tank. I called my credit union and discovered that account had been compromised too, with $8,400 withdrawn over 6 weeks through electronic transfers I never initiated. My total losses across both institutions were just under $62,000, which was every dollar I had saved in the 3 years since I'd finally dug myself out of the financial crater my ex-fiancé had left me in. I sat on my kitchen floor at 1 a.m. with bank statements spread around me like evidence at a crime scene, and I traced every withdrawal, every transfer, every fraudulent account back through the dates and the details, and I saw the pattern. The person who did this knew exactly when my direct deposits hit. They knew the precise limits that would avoid triggering automatic alerts. They knew which questions my bank asked for verification because they had the answers. Everything pointed to someone with intimate, sustained access to my daily life and personal information. Everything pointed to the man on the train. I filed a police report the next morning, and the officer who took my statement, a young guy who looked like he was barely out of the academy, was sympathetic but clearly overwhelmed by the scope of what I was describing. He wrote everything down and told me a detective would follow up. 3 days later, Detective Amos Ryland called me from the Financial Crimes Unit. He had a voice like gravel and a directness that I immediately appreciated because I was done with people being gentle with me. He asked me to come to the precinct and bring everything I had: bank statements, credit reports, screenshots of the texts Elliot and I had exchanged, the name and number I had for him. I spent the night before our meeting organizing 2 years of financial records into a binder with tabs and color-coded sections because, when your life is falling apart, organizing paper is the only control you have left. Detective Ryland looked at my binder, then looked at me, and said, "Most people come in here with a sandwich bag of crumpled receipts. You're going to make my job either very easy or very complicated." He was 51 years old with 23 years in financial crimes, and within an hour of reviewing my materials, he told me 2 things. First, the phone number I had for Elliot was a burner registered to a fake name. Second, the pattern of withdrawals from my accounts matched a method his unit had been tracking across the region for over 2 years, linked to at least 4 other victims. I wasn't the only one. That fact hit me like cold water. Detective Ryland explained that his unit had been investigating a series of identity theft cases that shared an unusual signature. The perpetrator didn't use phishing emails or data breaches or any of the typical digital methods. Instead, the thief cultivated long-term, in-person relationships with targets, often in transient public settings like trains, coffee shops, and waiting rooms, and extracted personal information through what Ryland called social engineering over an extended timeline. The other victims were people like me, single professionals, financially independent, trusting enough to share details with someone who seemed harmless. One woman, a paralegal named Margot Hollister, had lost over $90,000 to someone she described as a gym buddy who'd worked out next to her 3 times a week for 2 years. Another victim, a retired school principal named Dominic Ferrara, had been befriended at a weekly chess meetup in the park. Same method every time: slow trust building, careful information extraction, patient financial exploitation, and then a clean disappearance once the money dried up. Ryland pulled up a composite sketch that had been generated from Margot's description and asked me if it looked familiar. The face on the screen was a softer version of Elliot, same bone structure, same forgettable pleasantness, but with different glasses and a beard. My chest tightened so fast I had to grip the edge of his desk. The investigation moved faster than I expected because I had something the other victims didn't: 5 years of proximity. I knew which train Elliot took, which car he preferred, which stop he boarded at, and approximately when he arrived at the platform each morning. I also had 3 photographs of him that I'd taken over the years without thinking much about it. Candid shots from mornings when the light through the train window was good and I was testing my phone camera. Detective Ryland sent those photos to a facial recognition database and got a partial match within a week. The man I knew as Elliot Grain had used at least 4 other names across 3 states in the past decade. His real name, according to a fraud conviction in Delaware from 8 years earlier, was Noel Ashford. He'd served 14 months for credit card fraud, been released on probation, and vanished from his probation officer's radar within 6 months. The Delaware case was small time compared to what he'd been doing since. Ryland estimated the total amount stolen across all known victims was approaching $400,000. He introduced me to Special Agent Priya Okonkwo from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, a woman in her early 40s with a calm intensity that made you feel simultaneously reassured and terrified because she handled cases that crossed state lines. She looked at my binder and said, "This is the most organized victim file I've ever received." I told her organization was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. The weeks that followed were a strange combination of agonizing patience and sudden, violent revelations. Agent Okonkwo subpoenaed records from the burner phone company and traced the device to a prepaid account purchased at a convenience store in Millhaven, the same town where Elliot boarded the train. Security camera footage from the store showed him buying the phone with cash 13 months before I noticed the first fraudulent charge on my accounts. 13 months of planning before he made a single move against my money. That level of patience was what made him so dangerous and so hard to catch. Meanwhile, I was drowning. My landlord Gretchen gave me a 2-week extension on rent, but I could see the discomfort in her face. Like she wanted to be sympathetic but also needed to protect herself. My boss approved an emergency advance on my salary, which covered groceries and gas but nothing else. Joelle lent me $2,000 without my asking because she showed up at my apartment with takeout and an envelope and said, "Don't you dare make this weird." I cried into pad thai while she sat next to me and didn't say a word, which was exactly what I needed. The credit monitoring service Elliot had recommended turned out to be registered to a P.O. box in Nevada under a company name that didn't exist. Every thread I pulled revealed another layer of his infrastructure, and every layer made me feel more stupid for not seeing it. I hired a lawyer named Leonard Ashby through a referral from Agent Okonkwo. He specialized in financial fraud recovery and had worked with federal agencies on restitution cases for 15 years. He was tall, deliberate in his speech, and had a habit of pausing mid-sentence as if weighing every word for legal liability before releasing it. At our first meeting, he laid out the reality in terms that were honest and brutal. Even if Noel Ashford was caught and convicted, the likelihood of recovering all my money was low. Criminals like him moved funds through multiple accounts, converted cash to cryptocurrency, and spent it faster than courts could trace it. The legal process for restitution could take years and often yielded pennies on the dollar. He said my best hope was the federal investigation building a strong enough case to seize assets at the time of arrest. I sat in his office looking at the framed degrees on his wall and felt the floor dropping out from under me again because I'd spent 3 years rebuilding after my ex had destroyed my finances. And now I was right back in the same hole, dug by someone I'd trusted even more. Leonard must have seen something on my face because he added, quietly, that he'd handled cases like mine before, and sometimes the outcome was better than the math suggested, which was the lawyer equivalent of a hug, and I took it. Detective Ryland called me on a Friday evening in November to tell me they had located Noel Ashford. He was living in a rented apartment 11 miles from Millhaven Station, under yet another name, Graham Kelleher. He was still taking the 7:15 train, but had switched to a different car entirely. He was also, Ryland told me with barely concealed satisfaction, sitting next to a new target, a woman who boarded at the same stop and had been commuting with him for approximately 3 months. When he told me that, my vision actually went white for a second. Not metaphorically. The edges of my sight genuinely blurred, and I had to sit down because the idea that he was already doing this to someone else, that I was not the ending of his pattern but just another chapter in it, made me so angry I couldn't form words. Ryland said they were building the case carefully because they wanted to catch him with enough evidence to ensure federal charges, not just a state-level slap on the wrist. He needed me to be patient. I told him I understood. I did not feel patient. I felt like driving to Noel Ashford's apartment and screaming until the neighbors called someone. Instead, I went to the gym and ran on the treadmill until my legs stopped working, which was the healthiest version of rage I could manage. The next 3 weeks were the worst of my life. I was going to work every day, performing competence in meetings, answering emails, pretending my entire financial existence hadn't been hollowed out by a man I'd considered a friend. At night, I lay awake doing math in my head, calculating how many years of saving it would take to rebuild what I'd lost, how far behind this put my plans for buying a home, whether I'd ever feel safe with money again. I started having panic attacks in the shower, which was inconvenient and humiliating. My therapist, Dr. Adeline Moreau, who I'd been seeing since the breakup with my ex, adjusted my sessions to twice a week and told me the anxiety wasn't a sign of weakness, but a normal neurological response to sustained betrayal. She used the term relational trauma and explained that being exploited by someone you trusted activates the same fear circuits as physical danger. My brain was treating every human interaction as a potential threat because it had learned twice now that people who seem safe can destroy you. She was right, and knowing she was right didn't make it easier. I stopped talking to the other commuters on the train. I stopped making eye contact with the barista at the coffee shop near my office. I pulled inward like a turtle, shell first, and hated myself for it. December brought the crisis to a head. Agent Okonkwo called me on a Wednesday afternoon and said the FBI was planning to arrest Noel Ashford within the next 72 hours but needed my cooperation. They wanted to use my testimony and financial records as the foundation of their case, and they needed me to positively identify him in person. Not from photos, but in the flesh, during a controlled encounter at the train station. The idea of seeing his face again made my hands go numb. She explained that the identification was important because Ashford's defense would almost certainly argue that the photos I had were insufficient to establish identity, given that he'd been using prosthetic alterations and appearance changes across his various identities. The FBI had arranged for me to board the 7:15 on Friday morning wearing a wire, sit in the car where Ashford was now riding, and establish verbal contact that would confirm his voice matched recordings from the burner phone. I would not need to confront him directly. I would not need to say anything that revealed the investigation. I just needed to be close enough for the equipment to capture a clear voice print. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it, then went home and threw up. Thursday night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running scenarios in my head. What if he recognized the wire? What if he bolted? What if the whole thing fell apart and he disappeared again like he had in Delaware? Joelle came over and sat with me until midnight, not because I asked, but because she could hear something in my voice when I called her. She brought wine I couldn't drink and a puzzle she spread out on my coffee table so we'd have something to do with our hands. Around 11, she looked at me across the scattered puzzle pieces and said, "You know you don't have to do this. They can find another way." I told her I knew, but I also told her that for 5 years, I'd sat next to a man who was systematically taking everything from me. And I'd smiled at him and brought him coffee and told him about my mother's maiden name. And if I could sit next to him for all that time without knowing what he was, I could sit next to him one more time knowing exactly what he was. Joelle stared at me for a long moment, then nodded and went back to the puzzle. That was the best pep talk I've ever received, and it contained 0 words of encouragement. Friday morning was cold and bright, the kind of December day where the air tastes like metal and your breath comes out in clouds. I got to Millhaven Station at 6:50 a.m., and met Agent Okonkwo in the parking lot. She was in an unmarked sedan with a tech specialist named Ramon, who fitted me with a recording device so small I could barely feel it. Okonkwo went over the plan one more time. I would board the train, walk to car 6 where Ashford had been sitting for the past several weeks, and take a seat near him. I would initiate a brief, casual conversation, something natural enough that he wouldn't suspect anything. If he responded, the microphone would capture his voice. If he didn't respond or if anything felt wrong, I was to move to a different seat immediately and text the code word to Okonkwo's phone. The code word was Blueberry. An FBI team would be on the platform at the next station, ready to board if needed. 2 plainclothes agents were already on the train in adjacent cars. I asked Okonkwo what happened if he ran. She said, "He won't get far." Something in her voice made me believe her completely. I boarded the 7:15 feeling like my skeleton was vibrating inside my skin. The walk from the platform to car 6 took maybe 45 seconds and felt like 45 minutes. I stepped through the doors and scanned the seats, and there he was. 3rd row from the back, window seat, reading his phone. Same wire-rimmed glasses. Same leather messenger bag. Same forgettable, pleasant face that I'd trusted for half a decade. He was sitting next to a woman with dark hair who was typing on a laptop, and I felt a surge of fury so intense that my peripheral vision narrowed. That was his new target. That was the next me. I forced myself to breathe and walked past them to a seat 2 rows ahead on the opposite side. I sat down, put my bag on my lap, and pretended to look at my phone while my heart hammered so hard I was sure the microphone was picking it up. The train pulled away from the station. I counted to 60 in my head. Then I stood up, turned around, and walked back toward his row like I was heading to the bathroom at the rear of the car. When I reached his row, I stopped, let my eyes land on him with an expression of surprise I'd been practicing in my bathroom mirror since 5 a.m., and said, "Elliot? Oh my God, hi." He looked up and I watched his face cycle through recognition, surprise, and something cold behind his eyes that lasted exactly 1 second before his social mask clicked into place. He smiled. "Nadia. Hey. Wow, it's been a while." His voice was the same. Warm, measured, familiar. The voice that had asked me about my weekend plans and my mother's health and my bank's customer service every morning for 5 years. The microphone caught every syllable. I chatted with him for maybe 90 seconds, asked how he'd been, said I'd switched to an earlier train, mentioned I was thinking about his architecture book recommendation from last year. He was smooth and relaxed and said all the right things. And the whole time I was looking at his face and seeing the geometry of a lie so enormous and so patient that it still takes my breath away when I think about it. I walked back to my seat and sat down. My hands were shaking so badly I put them under my thighs to keep them still. 3 stations later, the train stopped at Ridgemont, and through the window I saw 4 people in FBI windbreakers walking briskly toward car 6. The doors opened. The agents boarded. There was a commotion behind me that I didn't turn around to watch because Agent Okonkwo had told me not to. I heard Ashford's voice, louder now, saying he didn't understand and there must be a mistake. I heard the woman next to him gasp. I heard the words, "Noel Ashford, you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud." I sat very still, looking forward, and I felt tears running down my face that I didn't wipe away because my hands were still trapped under my legs. When the agents walked him off the train past my row, he looked at me. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. I don't know what he saw in my face. I hope he saw everything he'd taken and everything I was going to get back. Then he was gone through the doors and onto the platform where Detective Ryland was waiting with handcuffs that caught the morning sunlight. The aftermath unfolded over months with the grinding, unsexy pace of federal prosecution. Noel Ashford was indicted on 23 counts spanning 5 states. The evidence included my financial records, Margot Hollister's testimony, Dominic Ferrara's testimony, the voice print from the train, security footage, phone records, and a laptop seized from his apartment that contained detailed dossiers on 9 confirmed victims, and 3 he was still actively developing. I was victim number 4 in the court documents, which felt dehumanizing until Leonard Ashby told me that being a numbered victim in a federal case was actually a form of protection and power, because it meant the full weight of the Department of Justice was behind my name. The trial was set for the following spring. In the meantime, the FBI's forensic accountants traced approximately $280,000 of the stolen funds to cryptocurrency wallets and secondary bank accounts that Ashford had maintained under his various identities. Asset seizure proceedings began. Leonard filed a restitution claim on my behalf and told me to expect partial recovery, not full, but more than he'd initially feared. The other victims filed similar claims. Margot Hollister and I spoke on the phone twice, long, painful conversations where we compared stories and realized how similar our experiences had been. The slow trust building, the careful extraction, the patient destruction. She'd trusted her gym buddy with details about her retirement accounts. I'd trusted my train companion with the architecture of my entire financial life. We'd both been chosen because we were independent, competent, trusting women who had no reason to suspect that kindness could be a weapon. The trial lasted 9 days the following April. I testified on the third day, sitting in a witness box across from Noel Ashford for the first time since the train. He was wearing a suit and had shaved his head, which made him look different enough that I understood why facial recognition had only returned a partial match. His lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Gideon Pierce, tried to argue that Ashford's conversations with me were normal social interactions and that any information I'd shared was given voluntarily. He asked me on cross-examination if Ashford had ever asked me directly for my social security number. I said no. He asked if Ashford had ever explicitly requested my banking passwords. I said no. He asked if it was possible that I had simply been careless with my personal information and that someone else entirely had committed the fraud. I looked at Gideon Pierce and then at Ashford and said that in 5 years, Elliot never once told me a true thing about himself. Not his name, not his job, not his history, nothing. And that a person who constructs an entire false identity to sit next to you every morning for half a decade isn't having normal social interactions. The courtroom was quiet. Pierce didn't have a follow-up. Agent Okonkwo told me later that my testimony was the strongest of the 4 victim statements because I was calm, specific, and didn't cry, which apparently mattered to juries even though it shouldn't. I didn't cry because I'd used up all my tears months ago on my kitchen floor at 1 a.m. surrounded by bank statements, and I had nothing left but clarity. Noel Ashford was convicted on 19 of 23 counts, including wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison with mandatory restitution to all identified victims. The judge, a woman named Honorable Celeste Pratchett, who had presided over financial crimes cases for 18 years, said during sentencing that Ashford's method was among the most psychologically calculated she had encountered because it weaponized the basic human need for connection. She said he hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen his victim's ability to trust. When she said that, I felt something crack open in my chest that had been sealed shut since October. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like recognition, like someone in a position of authority had finally named the thing that had been eating me alive. He didn't just take my savings. He took the version of me that believed people were mostly good, that a friendly conversation on a train could be just that 5 years of shared mornings meant something real. That version of me was gone, and no restitution check was going to bring her back. Over the following year, I received approximately $41,000 in restitution payments, which was about 2/3 of what I'd lost. Leonard Ashby told me the remaining amount might trickle in over the next several years as additional assets were liquidated, but he wouldn't promise anything. I took what I got and tried to rebuild again for the 3rd time in my adult life. Joelle helped me set up new accounts with security protocols, so aggressive that my own mother couldn't access them without passing 3 levels of verification. Dr. Moreau continued our sessions and helped me work through the specific kind of grief that comes from losing trust in your own judgment. She told me something I think about every day, that being deceived by a skilled predator is not evidence of stupidity. It's evidence of humanity. Predators succeed because they exploit the best parts of us. Our openness, our desire to connect, our willingness to believe that the person next to us means well. The flaw isn't in the victim. The flaw is in the predator. I'm trying to believe that. Some days I do.